paper, I would like to explore this theme of revelation as it appears on the new Aino papyrus and in the tragedy as a whole, so far as we're able to tell from the other evidence that survives for that text. What I'd like to argue briefly, because this is only a short paper, is that the Aino had a sustained focus on the theme of revelation. And now, on the one hand, that is not that surprising, because ancient Greek tragedies very often did indeed turn on moments of shocking revelation, of changes, of recognitions. But on the other hand, I'd like to suggest that this pattern of concealment and then revelation, of hiding and bringing to light, seems to have been especially integral to the dramatic structure of the Aino, and as well as thematically central and explored in ways that often draw attention to the theatricality of this particular plot. In the light of that thematic interest, I'd then like to hypothesize how the new text might have fit into that theme as a whole and could represent a particularly intense moment of revelation within the play. So in order to think about the plot movements of Aino, it will be helpful to start with the text that you've just seen on Patrick's presentation, which, is the summary given by Hyginus, which, for the reasons that Patrick has just outlined, is generally taken by editors to be unusually helpful and reliable in giving us the broad contours of what is going on in this particular play, even if it clearly omits much that is actually of dramatic interest to us. I'm not going to read through it all just because you've already had eyes on this particular text, but if you can scan through that, even from this very bare bones summary of the plot, we can see how this play was patterned, as indeed so many tragedies were, around a series of intensely dramatic discoveries. So first of all, we have the discovery by Athamas and then by Themisto that Aino, who's been off worshipping Dionysus for many years, is actually still alive. Then we have the discovery that the children killed by Themisto's plotting are in fact her own, and what a dreadful moment of discovery that will have been. Then we have the discovery, or perhaps simultaneously with that or around that, we have the discovery of Aino's true identity. So this woman, this maidservant who Themisto has taken into her household, is actually her rival. And then we have the discovery that Athamas, in his madness while hunting, has not killed an animal, but has in fact killed his own child. And finally, albeit in a slightly different vein, we have the revelation of Aino's new identity as a goddess. So lots of moments of dramatic reversal, discovery, and recognition. Furthermore, I'd like to suggest that many of these discoveries are not just dramatic, but in fact intensely theatrical, for want of a better word, in the sense that they are to do with costuming and disguise, or people taking on roles that are not properly theirs. That is to say, we find actors playing the role of characters who are themselves dressed up as other characters. So first of all, we have Athamas' reintroduction of Aino into the palace in the guise of a slave, which then later leads to the discovery of her true identity. Second, we have the dressing of Themisto's sons in the clothes designated for Aino's sons, the clothes which then mark them for death. Now, of course, tragedy is full of characters who deceive others by pretending to be who they are not, or by professing to believe in something that they actually don't, to represent things that are false. And we also find characters in tragedy who deliberately exploit aspects of costuming and props in order to enact those manipulations. It is, however, rare, and surprisingly so, to find characters deliberately employing physical costuming and disguise in order to deceive others. Some examples that might spring to mind would be the false merchant in Sophocles' Philoctetes, Telephus in Euripides' Telephus, or Dionysus in the Bacchae, although as a god, of course, he's a little bit different. Those are the examples that most readily come to mind, and there's not a huge number of them. So in both the reintroduction of Aino in disguise into the house by Athamas, and then in Aino's subsequent dressing up of her rival's children, we find not only disguise, but a kind of engineered stage management of others. We have Athamas taking Aino and putting her in the house as a servant. We have Aino dressing one set of children up as another. Again, this might remind us at some level of other tragedies, for example, Odysseus masterminding Neoptolemus and the false merchant's actions in Sophocles' Philoctetes, or Dionysus overseeing Pentheus dressing up as a Maenad in his Bacchae. In all of these cases from the extant plays, these metatheatrical aspects, the aspects that draw attention to costume as a facet of theatre, have long been a focus of discussion. The heightened theatricality of these works is also suggested in the way that they conclude with devices which are themselves intensely dramatic. So, for example, at the end of the Bacchae, we have the bringing of a prop head, that is to say, a mask or a theatrical prop on stage. So, in Aino, this ease with which costume transforms a legitimate wife into a slave, or one set of children into another set of children, requires the audience to assume for the characters on stage the same kind of investment in the power and artifice of costume that they themselves need to assume while they're watching this play. As Francis Muir has written, disguise is a doubling of costume. That is to say, it is a concept that draws attention to the process by which theatrical reality itself is constructed. Now, this idea is expressed in a very well-known fragment of Euripides' Telephus, in which Telephus, the king, disguising himself as a beggar, says, "For I must seem a beggar to be who I am, but not appear so." So we have him dressing up and deliberately drawing attention to that gulf between his appearance and his reality. Now, notoriously, this scene comes from, this quotation is preserved in a scene in Aristophanes' Acharnians, where Euripides, the playwright, is going through his past collection of theatrical props, among which are the rags of Telephus and the rags of Aino. Right, so Aino's disguise in her ragged costume, dressing up as a slave in the palace, is something which is being picked out in this later text as particularly emblematic of the way that Euripides uses costume, disguise, impersonation in order to convey that aspect of his theatrical practice. So, given the clear role of disguise, pretense, impersonation in the plot of Aino, I'd like to suggest that this theme can be useful to think with in terms of the inherent theatricality of what's going on in this tragedy, and to use that as a kind of framework for thinking about the dramatic nuances of our text. So, how then might the new Euripides fragment fit into this? And as Patrick has already alluded to, first of all, we do need to think about what kind of text we're dealing with, which is not a straightforward question. So two of the first editors of the fragment, Jean Gibert and Ivona Trinka-Amrine, as just outlined, argue in their extensive interpretative discussion of the piece that what we have is one continuous scene in which an onstage Aino is vaunting at the moment of triumph, and we have an offstage Themisto who is lamenting, which would give us this incredibly unusual kind of onstage, offstage quasi-dialogue between the two women, where Aino can hear her rival, but her rival can't hear her, and it would be this very interesting configuration of on and off stage. At the conference at Washington last year, where the four of us speaking today were all very fortunate enough to be included, we all provided a range of first responses to this fragment, including quite a debate over whether or not that hypothesis is correct, that continuity hypothesis. We suggested various possibilities, such as this may be a single scene, but with some parts extracted. It could be a series of gnomic excerpts, but which do, in some passages, display dramatic continuity, or perhaps the most nihilistic of the opinions expressed, just a complete random series of quotations with some removed from what was originally written. And since then, Patrick has published an article as well, which argues at some length for the discontinuity hypothesis. So as I mentioned, in their discussion, Gibert and Trinka-Amrine suggest that what we have is an onstage triumphant Aino celebrating the success of her plot to murder the children, and an offstage distraught Themisto. We would then find Aino responding to and commenting on her rival's cries within the house without Themisto herself being aware of that. As I said, this would be a really remarkable configuration of onstage and offstage action. In that case, the scene on the papyrus would give us Aino at the moment where she no longer needs to be in disguise, right? She's thrown off her rags, metaphorically if not literally, and she's assumed her full persona as the mistress of the household. On stage and no longer constrained, Aino at last assumes maximum visibility in her own persona and needs to act no longer. But is this a continuous scene? Now, the passage as a whole, and I know you've just seen a very quick snapshot of it, does contain an unusually high number of sententious lines. And I should say that I actually have no problem envisaging a speech which consists mainly of sententia if there's a dramatic point to it, right? So if there is a character who is being brought on stage because their point is to be the conveyor of traditional wisdom, or there is some political reason as to why they can't refer to the specifics of the situation, we may indeed have an authentic speech which is unusually full of gnomic sententious material. But is a scene of triumph at having just bested your rival, that kind of moment? I think probably not. On the one hand, such a moment might well incorporate gnomai about the downfall of the proud or the wicked, the victory of the just, and so on. On the other hand, we'd surely expect a little bit more reference to the actual specifics of the situation. And for that reason, as well as various other structural oddities and some challenges around observing continuous thought, I also do find it quite difficult to read the fragment as one continuous text. There also seem to be lines that are perhaps suggestive of different moments within the trajectory of the plot. The first two lines where the speaker refers to filling the mother with anger could well come from a scene placed after Themisto has devised her plan to kill Ino's children, but before the killings have actually taken place, or indeed as they are at that moment taking place. However, later lines in the papyrus, the mention of cries within the house, of what was previously unclear, now shining out, the reference to a just victory and an evil cause, which we find later, all of those sentiments seem quite coherent with coming after the killings have taken place, which would seem, at least to me, to indicate we possibly have two different timeframes at least represented on this papyrus. There is some discontinuity at least between this opening couplet and what comes later. But on the other hand, we can also see that not all the lines are sententious. The lines I've given you here, 1 to 2, certainly do not look sententious, and they also are the closest that we come in this passage to those references to a specific dramatic situation. A bit later, we have a couplet where the second line, "It is fair, it seems, for a fair face to be put on evil deeds," as the first editors translate it, is quite sententious, but the line that comes before it, referring to lamentations or sound in the house, isn't. So there's moments where it's difficult to see kind of what the exerting impulse would be if this was simply a collection of excerpts. And there are also some sequences where we clearly can argue for some coherence of thought, even if the text itself is not straightforward continuous playtext. These lines here evidently refer to Themisto's rage. The lines that immediately follow, 3 to 4, refer to the reason for that rage, i.e. Athamas taking a second wife into his house. The turn in these lines from the changeable divinity who proceeds obscurely to something which was unclear and now shining out brilliantly is again thematically coherent. And towards the end of the passage, that collection of reflections on good and evil behavior, just and unjust behavior, is again thematically consistent, even if we don't think it represents one big block of speech. So we should keep open the possibility, I think, that what we have is probably not continuous script, but there may well be portions that do reflect movements within a scene. I'm also persuaded by the attribution of many of these lines to Ino as a speaker. So the sentiments expressed, most clearly the fragment that I just showed you, filled the mother with anger, maps very well onto her situation, of announcing things which were previously hidden coming to light. Again, that maps well onto the revelation of her plot. A bit later on, there's a line where she says that she hates those who kind of do dreadful things at haste, of prevailing in a just cause. Again, all of these fit very well onto Ino's situation, condemning the behavior of her rival Themisto, and it all seems to be entirely consistent with what we know of Ino's role in the drama. So let's look again at that opening section in the light of this focus on concealment and revelation. In the first two lines, the first editors of the text read "Plaisat," I filled the mother with anger, although James Diggle has suggested "Plaisat," fill the mother with anger, and Patrick in his article has shown the spacing of that works better on the papyrus. Either way, what we have clearly is a reference, as the editors suggest, to the news of Ino's return arousing rage and jealousy in Themisto, which was then directed towards her rival's children. The fact that the emotion here is anger rather than grief seems to place it in that time frame of the drama. In that case, it would be the news that Ino has been found that is causing Themisto to nurse her anger. But given this emphasis on the theatricality, the deception wrought here by Ino, I wonder if there is a case for seeing a slightly more active role for Ino here, since in her disguise as a maidservant, she actually becomes centrally involved in the murder plot. She is the one who switches the clothing. She is involved as an accessory in this. Did Aino, once she learned of Themisto's intentions towards the children, actively encourage the rage, for example, seeing it as the perfect opportunity to get revenge? In this case, the hope that Themisto may enjoy, take pleasure in sacrificing to the gods may be even darker than the sarcastic tone posited by the first editors, perhaps suggesting a hope that Themisto really will, in her ignorance, enjoy killing the children, which will then make the discovery that those are her own children even more devastating. Envisaging a more active role here in that injunction, either I filled or fill, that really strong kind of command, envisaging this more active role for Aino in directing Themisto's rage towards the wrong targets would then resonate with this dramatic conceit of characters being manipulated into roles that they don't even realize they are playing. We now come to the line that supplies the title of my paper, What Was Unclear shines out brilliantly among, or perhaps with, witnesses, which does seem to me to be extremely likely to refer to the revelation of the truth about Aino's identity and the role that she has played in engineering the deaths of Themisto's children. Now, using this kind of language of revelation at a moment of revelation, again, is not surprising in tragedy, but a very good number of the other fragments of Aino that we already knew about from the book tradition suggest that attention was drawn at many points in the play to precisely this theme of concealment and revelation involving these two women, and particularly in quite ironic contexts. So let's just take a moment now to look at some of the other pieces of Aino that we already knew about from the secondary tradition. In Aino fragment 410, we are told that a wife should always be served by such a woman who will not keep silent about what is right and who hates what is shameful and keeps it before her eyes. Now, this is obviously a reference to Aino disguised as Themisto's new servant, and the speaker, whoever they may be, is outlining the code of behaviour that this new servant is expected to follow. The references to both of these expectations are, of course, deeply ironic, right? In that this apparent servant is going to be doing the exact opposite of the first injunction, i.e. keeping silent about what is not right when she becomes an accessory in the infanticide, and it's in fact her mistress's own behaviour that Aino is going to observe and observe closely and keep before her eyes. Yet after the revelation of the truth about her identity and her role in the plot, she does actually follow this advice after all, right? Boasting openly, as we perhaps see in the new fragment, about what she has done, and openly professing her contempt for the shameful deeds of Themisto. She does follow this advice, that is to say, but only at the point in the plot at which she is no longer playing a role. Whoever spoke these lines, if not Aino herself, clearly did not intend for their advice to play out in that particularly twisted way. Similarly, in fragment 413, we have another reflection on the appropriateness of when to speak and when to keep silent. Plutarch, who's one of our sources for lines 1 to 2 of this fragment, describes them as Aino exercising her freedom to speak. And it's been suggested that Aino speaks these lines while in disguise as a servant, presenting herself, despite her humble status, as nobly born, and therefore possessing an innate ability to distinguish between good and bad behaviour. Once again, if that is the context, this is highly ironic, right? On the surface, it seems to answer the fragment above, 410, in confirming her suitability as Themisto's maidservant. Right? She's a servant who really does know when to keep silent, when to speak out. However, everything again here has this double meaning, coming from a character currently in disguise and keeping silent about the truth for her own safety. The irony would be even more pointed if this came from a context in which Themisto was telling her new servant to keep silent about the murder plot. But again, that's just a hypothesis. There are further references to hiding and concealing among other fragments of this play as well. In 411, the dangerous potential of even the smallest revelation of what ought to be kept hidden to grow exponentially out of control is highlighted. And in the fragment below, 416, we learn that mortals, through daring behaviour, hide away their own troubles. So again, this thematic focus throughout the book fragments on when to speak, when to reveal, when to keep silent, when to show. And fragment 412 once again reflects on this importance of speaking from the heart and of not letting fear keep what ought to be spoken in silence, coupling this, as in some of the text we just saw, with reflection on the correlation of this kind of behaviour with social status. Once again, these ideas are resonant in the light of Aino's disguised status, where her appearance as an apparently innately noble slave conceals a rather more complex truth. So from this very quick overview of some of the book fragments, what I just want to kind of suggest is the thematic centrality of these ideas of concealment and revelation, coupled with this very dramatic situation between the two women, where we have this complex interplay of one keeping the truth from another, one telling the other to keep silent, this nexus of deception and revelation. So from this, we can see that this question of what ought to be kept unspoken, invisible, and hidden is heavily represented in the book fragments and seems to have been a thread running through the drama. It's in light of this that reference to the obscure and the shining in the new papyrus fragment takes on a more pointed significance if we are right to think that it also marks a turning point in the play's configuration of knowledge and deception that comes with Aino reassuming her true identity, not acting anymore, but appearing as herself. As we all know, however, in Greek tragedy, the moment at which someone appears to be in control of the situation is very often the moment at which they are not. And here, Aino's joyful vaunting and her apparent control is only fleeting, as this will have been followed at the end of the play by the death of her son Learchus at the hands of his own father and her leap into the sea with Melicertes. So how then did this patterning of the seen and the unseen, the hidden and the revealed, of knowledge and control play out at the end of the drama? There are more devastating revelations to follow, and it seems that at least one of these was again communicated through clothing and the uncovering of a child's body to reveal his identity, in the scene preserved on Pioxy 5131, which has been attributed to Aino and which again Patrick has introduced to you. In this papyrus published in 2012, we find a scene involving Athamas and most probably Aino. It almost certainly comes from this play. And someone is carried on stage, almost certainly a dead child. It's been argued that this comes from the end of the Aino, where the body of Learchus, the son of Aino and Athamas, is brought back to the palace and lamented by his parents. Remember from the summary of Hyginus we looked at the start that he's been killed by his own father in a fit of madness. In lines 10 to 11 of this fragment, someone says, "Strip bare, reveal to the light, so that not escaping notice in robes," which has been taken as a reference to the uncovering of the child's body on stage. David Kovacs in his discussion has suggested that at this point, Athamas even holds out some hope his son may still be alive, right? So he's uncovering it and this dreadful moment where he realizes that he has killed his own son and he is definitely deceased. Which would make this moment even more significant as the uncovering of the body confirms the identity and his status. The unwrapping of the child's corpse here seems to echo that revelation of the other children's true identities when they were wrapped up in the wrong colour garments earlier in the play. We don't know how that moment was represented in the plot, but wouldn't it be fantastic if it was shown on stage, right? The mother going to uncover the bodies of the children and realising they are her own, something that we would then see reversed and echoed at the end of the play. So, to come to the end of this short paper, we've suggested that these motifs of deception, disguise, concealment, and impersonation, and then the subsequent bringing to light of the truth, played a central role in the plot of Aino. And I've suggested that especially in the interaction between the two women, Aino and Themisto, we can kind of productively read that interaction in terms of theatricality and control. We can think of Aino's plot as an extended mise-en-scène in which she both plays her allotted part and manoeuvres others into the roles in which she has cast them. Themisto as murderous mother, remember that, fill the mother with rage, and Themisto's children as sacrifices, as innocent victims. If this new fragment does indeed represent, at least in part, that turning point of the deception, Aino abandoning her act and finally saying what it is she's done and taking ownership of that, it also marks a shift in her command of the play's events, after which we know things will rapidly spiral out of control. Deception and revelation in this play seem closely bound up with issues of performance and theatricality, especially appropriate for Aino, who has just returned, let us not forget, from years of service to Dionysus, the god of theatre. The new Euripides papyrus, difficult and frustrating as it no doubt is, might indeed help us to bring just a few more things that previously were obscure shining into the light. Thank you.